And now a little story from the apple seed.
Thank you so much. Well, when I was in my early 30s living in London, I had a Damascus Road experience. I fell irrevocably in love with the Lord. I realized that he was who he said he was. I gave up my PR business, went to Bible school and became a minister. And I never thought that becoming a minister would land me in prison. And it did. Many years later, in 2007, I became the Protestant chaplain at the largest men's prison in Maryland. Now, it was not my idea to become the Protestant chaplain at the largest men's prison in Maryland. No, it was not. I was asked. First of all, it was by Marcus. He was the inmate pastor. There's a very vibrant church of 600 men called Grace Church behind the walls. They've even got a seminary all paid for by outside funds. And I'd volunteered in the church, and he asked me. And then a person who played a pivotal role in the prison administration, they asked me several times to apply. And then my pastor told me he thought I should apply. And I thought to myself, are they crazy? Can't they see I am not prison chaplain material? I'm creative. I'm a free spirit. I can't be bound by bars. But of course, I didn't say that to them. I told them all I'd pray about it. And when I did, I thought, oh no, this is a God thing. And I felt like an old war horse sniffing the next battle, sniffing the blood. But I did what many people would do in that situation. Many probably here have already done it. When you're faced with a situation you know is going to be difficult, you know is going to be bloody, but you just plunge in anyway. And that's exactly what I did. So I applied for the job and I got it. But it was a government position, so it was frozen for some months. And during that time, a new prison opened on the other side of the state in Cumberland, and they took all the leaders of that 600-man church, all the leaders. So the pastor, the assistant pastor, the head of the deacons board, the head of the ministers board, the head of the choirs, they moved all of those leaders to that new prison. Well, the remaining inmate congregation were in shock. And they were also grieving the loss of their last chaplain, who was an African-American pastor. He'd been in the position for 16 years. He'd started the church. So at the beginning and end of services, men would gather and they'd glower. And I'd hear them say things like, don't want a woman chaplain. Shouldn't be a female chaplain. It says in the word that a woman shouldn't have authority over a man. I don't want a female chaplain. Well, as you can imagine, this got a little old. And so at the end of one of the services, I addressed the congregation and I said, gentlemen, I said, I believe you all know that the Lord has put a great love for you in my heart. And all over that room, men nodded because they knew that was true. And I said, I believe you know that within the confines of the law, I would do anything I could to help you. And again, all over that room, there were nods because they knew that was true too. I said, well, gentlemen, there are two things I can't do for you. I can't be a man and I can't be black, so get over it. and they too had the grace to laugh. But the guards, the prison officers, they didn't want, the correctional officers, they didn't want me either. Often when I came into the facility, there would be little knots of officers and I'd hear them muttering things like, I don't want a female chaplain. It's not right. It's a safety issue. It's not safe to have a female chaplain. I don't want a woman chaplain. And if any of them said it to my face, which they did, I would say, officer, it wasn't my idea. Take it up with the Almighty. But I realized I could not change in the way they all wanted me to change. I couldn't be a man. So I thought, well, what can I do? I mean, what have I got going for me? And I'm a compassionate, motherly type of figure. And many of those men have been raised by their mothers and their grandmothers. And then I'm British, which means that I make a fabulous cup of tea. So I thought, Mama, go with what you got. And I got permission to take an electric tea kettle behind the walls, and I was determined to use that to build a community behind the razor wire. I made tea on every possible opportunity. On cold winter nights, I'd rush out to the compound where the officers were guarding, and I'd say, officers, may I make you tea? I want to turn you all into Englishmen. And they smiled, and eventually they softened. And then I made tea as many times as possible for the inmates. Now, I brought in many different kinds of tea so they'd have the luxury of choice. There isn't much choice for men in a prison, but I bring in lots of different kinds. And we had regular leadership meetings because with the prayers and help of many volunteers, I was raising up a new leadership team to take the place of the ones that had been shipped out to the other prison. And so I would, as the men were gathered, I would make tea and I'd say, Prince, what kind of tea would you like? I must tell you, there was probably about 8 men in my tiny office at this point. And I'd say, Prince, what kind of tea would you like? Chaplain, don't you remember? Oh, silly me, of course, yes. You like lemon verbena with 2 sugars. Yeah, that's right. Now, I just have to break out of the story just for a moment. And I always said that if I possibly could, I would tell you the name of Prince. Now, normally, I would never, ever tell you the real name or the real nickname of an inmate because they need to go under the radar. But Prince, whose name was Neil Spann, died a few years ago. He was a lifer, and lifers, they want their name to be spoken outside the prison and to be known for something good. And he fell in love with the Lord. He had a Damascus Road experience and really converted not long after he was in the prison. He was in for 30 years by the time he died. He wanted people to know that he did do good things, and he did. He trained up generations of young men who were going to get out of prison and really taught them and changed their lives. And he also taught me how to be a chaplain. And so that was Neil Spann. Now, he had a friend who was also a lifer, who was a gardener. And he got permission to bring seeds in, and he planted beautiful gardens. And he'd take the seeds from those flowers and give them to volunteers who he knew would garden. And he'd say, take these and plant them in your own garden so that something of my handiwork will bloom in freedom. So that was Neil Spann, and that was his friend. In this story, Neil is known as Prince. So, Chaplain, don't you remember? Oh, yes, I do remember. Of course, Prince. You like lemon verbena with 2 sugars? Yeah. Manny, what kind of tea would you like? Chaplain, have you forgotten? No, I haven't. You like black currant with 3 sugars? Yeah. You didn't forget. Big Mike, what would you like? Chaplain. Let me see. You like chamomile with 1 sugar? Yeah, you got that right. I made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cups of tea. But one day things changed. Michelin Man, who was known as MM, was a young man who really loved his mother. And I knew him well because he volunteered in the chapel often. And one day, his mother was taken seriously ill and whisked off to hospital. And because of the prison regulations, he couldn't call her there. So I gave him a phone call on my private line in my office. And I got through to the nurses' station and I told her what had happened. And she must have had somebody in the system. Well, first of all, she told me that his mother had been taken down for an emergency operation. But this is why I think she had someone in the system, because incredibly, this has never happened to me before or since. She patched me down to the operating room. His mother was already on the table with the anesthetic going into her, and yet they let her speak to her son. And I heard him say, I love you, Marbird. And he told me very shyly afterwards that she'd said, I love you too. Tweet, tweet. That was their private love code. And that was the last time that MM ever spoke to his mother, because she died later that night. And he was devastated. And he wasn't eligible to go to the funeral on the outside. And so I bent all sorts of regulations, and I told him to give me the names of 6 of his friends who had known Marbird. And I arranged to have a funeral in my office at the same time as the funeral on the outside. And the men gathered, and they started to pay tribute to Marbird. One said, well, he said, I'm so glad I knew her on the outside. She was a fabulous cook. I love being invited to your house for dinner. And another said, well, I'm so glad I knew her. She was so kind to me when my mother died. I don't know how I would have got through it otherwise. I'm never going to forget that. And another said, well, I only knew her here in the visiting room when she was coming to see you, and I was there. But I'll never forget. She always had a kind word for me. And that smile, I'm never going to forget that smile. And then the men sang Amazing Grace in 4-part harmony. and my office became holy ground. And then I tried something I didn't know whether they'd go for or not. I had brought in several bottles, small bottles of bubbles that had been left over from my niece's birthday party. And I said, gentlemen, I'm going to pray and commit Marbird's spirit to the Almighty. And then why don't we all blow bubbles, signifying her spirit raising from earth to be joined with her Saviour in heaven. And so I said the prayer, and then this man, this huge man, bulging with muscles, grabbed a tiny bottle of these bubbles and went, blew them in, went, goodbye, Marbird. And then a man on the other side of the room, completely covered in tattoos, he blew a stream, and he went, tweet, tweet. And then they all started doing it. They all started blowing bubbles. Goodbye, Marbird, tweet, tweet. Goodbye, Marbird, tweet, tweet. Goodbye, Marbird. My whole office filled up with bubbles. The men didn't want to stop blowing bubbles. It was goofy and real and incredibly honouring. And then I made them all tea with lots of sugar, because that's the British cure for shock. Well, news goes around a prison like wildfire. And when I look back, I realise that that was the moment that we became a community that loved and laughed and worshipped together. And I knew that things had changed because of the segregation unit, the SEG unit. That's the prison within a prison. Men are locked up there for 23 hours a day, and usually they've got their hands against the bars looking out over to the compound. And they catcall at anyone who walks past. No one is safe. Not mothers, not grannies, not ministers. The commissioner walked past one time and someone shouted out, "Nice rear end, Commissioner." Now you understand, that's not exactly the wording that he used. But the commissioner wasn't fazed. He just shouted back, "Thank you, I've been working out." But after that funeral, every time I walked past, there was absolute silence, which was the highest honour that those men could give me. But one time, as I was passing, someone did cry out, "Will you bless us, chaplain?" And oh, it was my honour. It was my privilege to pray a blessing over all those men, no matter what faith group they came from. Well, I left the prison about 2 years after the funeral. My work was done. A very strong leadership team had been raised up for Grace Church, and it is still going now. The church is still going strongly. So my task was done. But when I left, I did feel like that old warhorse. I was emotionally battered and bruised and absolutely exhausted. But I learned such a lot from my men. And I discovered something that British women have known for eons. And that is, you can't keep a good mama down, especially not when she makes a killer cup of tea. Thank you. And as part of this story, I'd like to read you something. Now, when I first went into the prison, the very first time, I was very moved, and so I wrote a poem. And I read it over the men. They loved it, and they would often ask me to read it over them as a blessing. And so I would like, with your permission, to read this poem over you as a blessing. I'm glad I'm seeing some nodding heads. Thank you. It's called Do Not Think. Do not think I have forgotten you, though you dwell in this desolate place. Though cold and gloom encircle you and despair has pushed out grace. The plans I have for you hold true, though all around has changed. Though your hopes and dreams are smashed, destroyed, your future rearranged. For there is destiny upon your life. I have not changed my mind. Your name is scribed upon my palm. You will not be left behind. My training grounds are mine to choose. This one's austere, no light. But from this stark, dank valley, you'll arise to fight my fight. I have called you to the nations. My plans are still in place. This darkness will turn into dawn. Let me hold you. Seek my face. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.